Well, good morning. Did you guys enjoy your swim into church this morning? It's a little muggy and a little wet out there, so hopefully you stayed dry coming in. We're in this series, as Josh said, when I never saw it coming. And in the series, we're taking a look at 4 stories from the life of David, the second king of Israel. And my hope is, as we dig into each one of those stories, that together we'll figure out changes we need to make in our lives so that when challenging people or challenging circumstances come, we can respond in a way that's consistent with our faith. After David killed Goliath, the story we looked at last week, he became this instant folk hero in Israel. And the people just began to sing his praises for his wisdom and for his victories in battle. And the more they literally sang his praises, the angrier Saul got. It burned inside of him until it literally drove him crazy. And on multiple occasions, he tries to take David out. Now, rather than retaliate every single time this happens, David runs. And finally, he runs into the wilderness where he hides for years as Saul tries to hunt him down. And I don't think David was actually really good at hiding. I don't think it was a skill of his, because as soon as he begins to hide, his family comes and joins him. There's nothing that helps you in hiding like having a crowd around you, right? So his family is there. They just made things easier for Saul. And over time, he amasses these guys who come to join his cause, and he has now 600 soldiers. Pretty tough to hide. And now they got to figure out a way to live. How are they going to feed their families? What are they going to do? And in that portion of Israel where David was hiding, there were lots of landowners who had huge flocks of sheep and goats. And the flocks were vulnerable to pillaging by anyone who came through. And so David and his men agreed to hire themselves out as armed guards for these shepherds. It's not very rewarding work for a soldier, but it pays the bills. And that's where we find David in 1 Samuel 25 this morning. He and his men are working for a very wealthy landowner who had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep. The Bible says he was very wealthy. The owner's name was Nabal. I'm going to ask your forgiveness all through this message this morning. My parents were raised in the heart of Appalachia. They didn't pronounce this Nabal. It was Nabal. And it wasn't even said like that. Connie mocked her family and mine yesterday when we were talking about this. She goes, yeah, his name was Nabal. So I won't go there, but if I call him Nabal, you know I'm referring to Nabal. It's just an old habit that's hard to break. The guy's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. And I love the way that the Bible contrasts their two temperaments. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman who'd made one bad decision in her life. Her husband was a surly man and was mean in his dealings. Twice a year, Nabal would bring his sheep and his goats together to be sheared. Those fleeces would be sold, turned into wool for garments. It was a huge payday for landowners. And the custom was for an owner to set aside a portion of his profit and give it to people who had protected his animals and those who had protected his servants while they watched over the flocks. It's kind of like tipping your waiter. It's not a rule that's written anywhere. It's not a law. It's just a nice way to say thanks for a job well done. So it's shearing time. It's payday for David and his men. And he sends 10 young soldiers to remind Nabal about their arrangement and to collect whatever it is it's going to give him. And they were great. The soldiers didn't demand. They didn't threaten. They just politely asked, please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. And they wait. And at last, Nabal responds and says, who is this David, really? And who is this son of Jesse? There are a lot of servants out there who are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I give my bread and my water and the meat I've slaughtered for my shearers to the men who've come from who knows where? Nabal is mean. He is dishonest. In true to form, as the Bible describes him, Nabal reneges on the agreement. Look, I don't even know who David is, let alone who you guys are and what person you've come from, so you're not getting anything. And these 10 soldiers just politely packed up their stuff, rode back to David, and when they arrived, they reported every word. Now, I don't know how you respond when something unexpected happens, but the Bible tells us how David responds here. He wasn't expecting this, and he is furious. And in his anger, we'll find out that there's only one thought that's consuming him moment by moment, and it's this simple question: how do I get even? So I honestly believe that David's dilemma is our dilemma. What do we do when we are unexpectedly and often undeservedly wronged? When we're cheated? When we're lied to or lied about? How do we respond when we are hurt deeply and without warning? I think the dominant narrative, if we could say one from David's day, was, if someone hits you, you hit back harder. Literally, if you kill my dog, I'm going to kill your dog and your sheep and your goats and your cattle, just to teach you not to mess with me ever again. That's the culture of David's day, but this has not been David's story until now. He's been the champion of patience and self-control, but that's about to end. At this point, David says to his men, "Strap on your swords." And David strapped on his sword too. And about 400 men went with David, while 200 stayed to watch the supplies. Nobody puts on a sword for a conversation. So we have a pretty good idea what's going through David's mind here. This is out of character for him. Whatever happened in this brief interval, what's happened to this young boy standing in front of Goliath declaring, "My trust is in God alone. It's not in military prowess. It's not in military power." Where is that, David? Showing patience and restraint are not very appealing options when we've been wronged by someone. Our natural tendency is to want to pay them back, to get even. It seems just. It seems fair. But it seldom solves anything. Fortunately, one of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "David sent his messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them." The servant saw it all, and he now validates the character of David and his soldiers who guarded them for months. These men were very good to us. They didn't mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. They didn't go into our tents and rob us blind. They never even so much as stole a sheep or a goat from us to feed themselves. These men were honorable, and night and day they were a wall around us. The whole time we were herding our sheep near them. And now he turns from telling her what happened to begging Abigail to do something. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. And he's such a wicked man, nobody can talk to him. Now, Abigail's a very smart woman. The Bible's already told us that. And what she does is brilliant here. She acts quickly, and she prepares a ton of food. I mean, this is a long list of things she gathers quickly. 200 loaves of bread, baskets and baskets of fresh and dried fruit, meat that she takes and sends to them. And she packages all of this up, and she sends her servants with the food ahead of her to intercept David, and she rides fairly far behind them. And as she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending towards her. And she met them. The Bible gives us an insight into what's in David's head. It tells us what he was saying just before she arrived. David had just said, "It's been useless. All my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness so that nothing of his was missing, and he's paid me back evil for good." It's a really powerful statement that David makes there. You get a sense that David has been wrestling, however long this journey was, he has been wrestling with this offense of Nabal. His anger, his fixation is consuming him. And finally, he just says to the guys that are riding near him exactly what he plans to do. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. He's going to up the ante. He's going to let loose all that pent-up rage and slaughter hundreds of innocent people who've done nothing to him. Here's one of the biggest lessons of this story. If I lose you somewhere between here and the end, here's a big lesson from this story. When we're blindsided, it's really easy to respond from anger. And I promise you that when we act out of anger, we always regret it later. Thank God for Abigail. Abigail is the hero of this story. She's been described as intelligent and beautiful, and she lives up to every bit of that. It's important in this next exchange that we understand that David really has no authority at this point. He's been appointed the next king of Israel, but he's not there yet. As long as Saul lives, David is just another guy in the nation of Israel. And there is no promise at this point that he will live long enough to ascend the throne. Abigail, as she confronts this powerless soldier, she's the wife of a very wealthy landowner. They own a huge chunk of land in Hebron, which is a prominent district in Israel. As such, she has more authority and more power than David does at this point. And in spite of her power, her influence, and her wealth, she chooses to humble herself before David. She gets down off her donkey. She shows him respect that would only be due the king of Israel. She bows low before him and puts her face in the dirt as she talks. She calls David her Lord, which is how they would have addressed the king, more than 15 times in 2 short paragraphs. And every time she talks about herself, she doesn't even say her name. She just calls herself his humble servant. And she encourages in her talk that David would find another way to deal with this offense. She says to David, "Please forgive your servant's presumption. Your Lord God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord." She's talking about his future as king. She's describing the kind of king that she hopes he'll become, and she's leading him to be a better man than he's about to be. Because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. And even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, she knows about Saul. The life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. It's a nice callback to David killing Goliath, isn't it? Back to the time when he was completely dependent on God. She goes on, "When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him, when God has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself." It's like, I pictured this week as I read this over and over. It's like she's playing this Jedi mind trick, right? Can you see Abigail standing in front of David and going, "This is not the battle you're looking for. You don't want this on your conscience, David, when you become king." And as she speaks, we begin to see that David's anger is slowly melting away. David realized just how close he is to blowing it all, and he responds to Abigail and says, "Look, praise be to the Lord our God, who sent you to me today. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands." And then he makes a promise to her and he says, "Go home in peace. I've heard your words. I've granted your request." Now, Abigail still has to go home to Nabal. And so she does. And when she gets there, she finds that he's still in the middle of this banquet, celebrating the sheep shearing and the goat shearing. And the banquet, the Bible says, was like that of a king. He spent a lot of money for this party, and he is in high spirits, and he is very drunk. So she didn't talk to him about it until daybreak. That is a smart person. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things. And get this, his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. We don't have any idea what happened, but based on this little description, it feels like he either had a massive heart attack or a stroke and went into a coma. And the Bible says about 10 days later, he died. And as soon as David hears the word, he sends a messenger to Abigail and says, "Would you be my wife?" And Abigail gets the word, and she quickly climbs on her donkey, grabs her 5 female servants, and goes and marries David. You know, I love that story. That's exactly what the Bible says. He's dead. You want to get married? Sure, let's go. It's a very brief period of grief for Abigail. These stories in the Old Testament are so rich. There's so much we can learn from them. This story has 3 very different characters who are focal points at different points in the story. And they have 3 very different responses to life's situations. First, we have Nabal, who repays good with evil. And when you read all about him in this chapter, I've hit the high spots. When you read all of the stuff about Nabal in this chapter, you find out that his behavior is maniacal. He is a crazy man. And I don't think there's anybody in the room this morning who truly sets out to repay good with evil. So we're going to set Nabal off to the side and just hope that that isn't you. Okay? And if it is, Darren wants to talk to you afterwards. He has some words of wisdom. So let's not talk about Nabal because more often we choose to be like David in this story, who pays back evil with more evil. David's story is not maniacal, it's predictable. It's how our world works, right? It's how governments work, it's how communities work, it's how neighbors work. And then there was Abigail, the hero of the story. She's surrounded by men who have chosen evil, and she chooses instead to return good for evil. Her response, her wisdom, her judgment, her negotiation with David are all incredible. Her story, when you read it, is remarkable. So I just have 3 simple questions I want to ask you this morning as you think about these 3 characters. First, where in your life are you leaning towards getting even? Who is it that's hurt you so deeply? All you want is for them to hurt too. Now, just that simple question, there are several of you in the room, probably not most of us, but several of you who can have a picture right now in your mind of the face of that person. Or you know that scene, that situation. It's there. It's really vivid in your memory. Now, most of us, I think when I ask that question, do what I did in my office thinking about this week. I went, I got nothing. There's nobody I want to get even with. So I'm going to ask you to do what I did and dig a little deeper. Is there a situation in your life where you've been hurt or offended? And even though you think you're over it, even though you think there's no chance you do evil for evil, that situation, that person, that group of people consumes your thoughts. It finds a way of working itself into your conversations. And when you talk about it, the cadence of your speech picks up. You have a little more energy behind it. And you feel the anger bubbling up inside of you. I'm going to say most of us have something like that in our lives. And if we dwell on that anger in that situation long enough, it will lead us to thoughts of revenge. So if you could, is there some situation in your life where you would repay evil with evil? Second question. What's the story you want to tell when this is just a story you tell? When this is all done, the situation, this conflict, this blindsided situation is over. And it's nothing more than a story that you tell about your life. What's the story you want to tell? David's really close to a different kind of story before Abigail stops him. She speaks to David's future, and she literally says to him, is this the story you want to tell about how you became king? Do you want to be that kind of a king who slaughters innocents until people are so afraid they don't resist you as their ruler? Do you want the blood of innocents on your hands? It's a powerful question. How we respond to life's toughest challenges dramatically impacts the arc of our story. And it begs the question for us, do we want our story to be predictable, evil for evil, or do we want it to be remarkable? And if we want it to be remarkable, then we need to write a different ending than the one we'd like to have or the one we have planned. So here's the third question. What would it look like for you to return good for evil? Now, if you're a Christ follower this morning, this isn't an optional exercise for you. It's an integral part of what it means for us to be a Jesus follower. When you think about him or her or them, when you think about your neighbor, your friend, your employer, your kid, your parents, your spouse, your ex, when you think about that context, that relationship, and the evil that has been done to you, what would it look like for you to return good for evil? The easy thing to do in that situation is to simply be neutral. Ignore them. And that's not an evil response. To do nothing in spite of the evil that's been done to you is to show mercy. But when we choose to do something they don't deserve, that's when we begin to extend grace. And that's always hard when we've been wronged. But I would suggest to you this morning that returning good for evil may be the most Christ-like thing that we ever do. The story of David and Abigail, as simple as it is, has had a ripple effect throughout history. Roll forward more than 1,000 years, and we find the Apostle Peter writing to a group of Christians who had done nothing but good. They had taken care of the sick and the poor. They were just doing their best to follow Jesus. And in spite of that, they were receiving evil. They were being hunted down. They were being tried and beaten and sometimes killed. And their only crime was following Jesus. And in that context, Peter gives them these words. When they are suffering incredible evil, he says, don't repay that evil with evil. Don't repay insult with insult. Sound familiar? On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, evil with good. Because to this you were called. When you accepted Christ, this was the call to live a remarkable life, to extend grace when you've been wronged, to extend good for evil. And we do that so that we can inherit a blessing. And I know that this is influenced by David because he now quotes Psalm 34, written by David, probably around the time that this happened. And David says, whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They have to seek peace and pursue it. We can choose in our life to repay evil with evil. And in many cases, when we do that, we can even do it within the bounds of our legal system and what the law allows. That's predictable. That's the way most people operate, whether they have a faith in God or not. I understand that it can be tough to abandon this option. I can understand that it's hard to not try to get even, to pay people back, even when your friends and family are encouraging you to go ahead and do it. As I sat in my office up there this week, I went, I got to be honest, there are a couple of people in my life that if I weren't a Christ follower, if I weren't trying to live a remarkable life, I'd like to rain some pain and terror down on them just to pay them back. It's just honest. But I can't. And I don't. Because it's not the life that Jesus has called me to. So I would encourage you this morning, don't write a predictable story. Whatever it is you're facing, take a different path. Choose the Abigail way when you're blindsided, rather than simply getting even. Choose to repay evil with good. Choose to extend grace instead of seeking revenge. Choose to do for others what they do not deserve and what they have not earned. Choose grace. And if you do, I promise you, you'll go a long way to making your life remarkable.